Mood disorders are another category of disorder. When we break it down, we have sort of like two different areas. We have depression, and then we have bipolar, which also includes a type of depression. So it's important to be able to differentiate and use the actual terminology for each of these disorders. So the first one that we think of when we typically think of depression would be major depressive disorder. And for major depressive disorder, that would include 2 or more weeks during which a person is feeling overwhelmed by things like sadness, apathy, hopelessness, worthlessness, and guilt. There's a whole list, but essentially the criteria to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder is 2 or more weeks with 5 or more symptoms. And again, that would be ongoing for that full 2 weeks, and it wouldn't be explained by things like a breakup or a death or something like that it just happened. So that's a really important thing to kind of differentiate in major depressive disorder. We then, under this category, have what we call kind of like a lower level of depression. It's called dysthymia, or persistent depressive disorder. And this is a mildly depressed mood, more often than not, for 2 or more years. So again, it's not going to be as extreme as what we see with major depressive disorder. So you still might like be functioning in your life and everything, and you're able to get out of bed most days and go to work or go to school, or possibly even hold on to relationships or things like that. But for whatever reason, for 2 or more years, you're feeling that depressed mood kind of coming and going, again, more often than not. A couple other things that would fall under here, but that aren't in your notes, would be seasonal affective disorder, which is known as SAD, or abbreviated as SAD. Remember, in Wisconsin, we experience this a little bit more in the winter months, and usually this is just a period of depressive symptoms, and it tends to be tied to lack of sunlight, so pretty easily fixed with light therapy. So just getting a light lamp from your doctor, just buying one of those, and then turning it on for 15 to 20 minutes a day will usually boost that energy in the winter months where the sun isn't really out. And then another one that's not on here would be postpartum depression. And we even talked about postpartum depression with psychosis, which is extremely rare. But postpartum depression is a type of depression that tends to happen after giving birth to a child for some women. And for the most part, postpartum depression goes away on its own in about a month or less. As we move through the category then, we look at bipolar disorder, and bipolar disorder is where a person alternates between periods of depression, which I've already explained to you, and mania. Mania is a state where a person is overly excited, hyperactive, optimistic. So when we look at mania, you, when you're going through a period of mania, would be experiencing extreme energy. You typically engage in behaviors that aren't exactly safe. You might go on gambling sprees, shopping sprees, things like that. So again, bipolar would be alternating between the two. Keep in mind that this is not correctly portrayed in the movies. So when we talk about bipolar disorder, it's typically not a minute-to-minute or hour-to-hour type of thing. It might be more of a week-to-week, or it could even be month-to-month. But bipolar disorder is easily, well, I shouldn't say easily, but it's treated with lithium. And when people take their medication on bipolar disorder, it tends to balance out those periods of mania and depression quite well. Just like when we looked at dysthymia with major depressive disorder, there's a disorder called cyclithmic disorder that kind of falls under bipolar disorder. So again, it's those alternating periods of depression, which technically would range in like the dysthymic area, so kind of a mildly depressed mood, and then that would alternate with some of the hypomanic symptoms, but that would have to go on for more than 2 years. So again, it might not be as extreme as what you would see in full-on bipolar disorder, but still it's demonstrating both levels of those symptoms in some way for at least 2 years. And then a newer one under this category is called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. This is a new DSM-5 disorder, and it's related to emotional volatility in children and adolescents. So this one's definitely had some criticisms in the DSM because people are worried that we're going to start to diagnose childhood outbursts and things like that as disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. But it is a new one to be aware of. Finally, how do we explain mood disorders, which are called affective disorders? There are lots of different ways to explain them. We could look at the biological model. In that, we're looking at genetics and biochemical. So genetics, we know that mood disorders tend to run in families, and there's a higher rate in identical than fraternal twins. So we do know that there's a genetic basis. There are also some biochemical things going on with this. So serotonin and norepinephrine levels in the brain are low during periods of depression and high during periods of mania. We also know that there can be some structural differences in bipolar brains. So then moving outside of maybe the biological model, a behavioral model would talk about reinforcement and conditioning. Martin Seligman talked about learned helplessness. Remember, learned helplessness is you've kind of failed over and over again when you've tried, so all of a sudden you've learned to not even try, even in places where you might be really successful. The social cognitive model talks about negative and irrational attributions. So when we're looking at this one, your explanatory style kind of tends to come in. And when we talk about your explanatory style, it's just the way that you tend to explain things that happen, like bad events or things like that. And they can be, when people talk about these, they talk about them as stable, global, and internal. And that creates kind of the perfect storm for depressive symptoms. Rumination is overthinking, so staying focused on a problem, like continually focusing on a problem and sort of just like overthinking it would be the way to explain it. So when we look at this example here, it talks about the cycle of depression. So for example, you have a stressful experience. The second thing then it might be ruminating, where you just talk about it, think about it all the time. And then if you have a negative explanatory style, that can obviously create issues. So when we look on the right-hand side here, you can see the explanatory style. When you explain something as stable, it means that it's very lasting, like you think that it's going to be going on forever. Global is taking something that's going on and making it seem like the only thing going on in your whole world, and like with this one thing going wrong, everything else is going wrong as well. And then internal is really personalizing it and thinking that it's all about you and that there are no other factors that play in. So on the left-hand side, we see sort of an unhealthy way to process, and on the right-hand side, we see more of a healthy way to process and cope. So then if we go back to the left, I had talked about number 2, so negative explanatory style, that can lead to a hopeless or depressed mood. And then number 4, there can be cognitive and behavioral changes in how we act. So behavioral changes might be because we're feeling this way, we decide that we don't want to spend as much time with our friends, we're lashing out at others, things like that. And cognitive would be, again, really thinking terrible things about ourselves and laying down those mental tracks. All of that then fuels number 1, and then we repeat. So this is just kind of walking you through that cycle of depression. Just in ending then, a reminder about perspectives and disorders in general, so not specific to mood disorders, but just as a reminder to you guys, if people were to take one specific approach to explaining disorders, on the right-hand side, you can see how they would explain the cause of the disorder. And then don't forget, we talked about medical model in the previous video, and we talked about the diathesis stress model.